You open your refrigerator tonight the way you do most nights, and there it is, a bag of shredded lettuce, or maybe a container of salad you picked up for convenience, sitting right there on the shelf where it's been sitting for days. Nothing about it looks wrong. It smells fine. It looks fine. And that's exactly the problem I want to talk to you about tonight, because right now there is a real ongoing outbreak connected to iceberg lettuce. And as of the most recent public health updates, more than 1,600 people have gotten sick. I want you to actually picture that number for a moment, not to frighten you, but because it's worth sitting with. 1,600 people, real people across several states who did something as ordinary as eating a salad or ordering food that came with shredded lettuce on it and ended up dealing with an illness that for some of them lasted for weeks. This isn't a story I'm bringing you to scare you into never eating a vegetable again. That wouldn't be honest and it wouldn't be useful. What I want to do tonight is walk you through exactly what's known right now, what's still being investigated, what this actually means if you're over 60, and most importantly, what you can do about it, starting with that refrigerator you're probably standing in front of right now. I'm Dr. Robert Vance, and if you've watched this channel before, you know my approach to something like this. I'm not here to create panic, and I'm also not here to tell you not to worry about something that genuinely deserves your attention. My job tonight is to give you clarity, what's confirmed, what's still uncertain, and what a reasonable, informed person does with that information. Let's start with what's actually happening. As of the most recent updates available at the time I'm recording this, health officials in the United States are investigating a multi-state outbreak of an illness called cyclosporiasis, caused by a microscopic parasite called Cyclospora. Investigators have linked a significant portion of this outbreak to shredded iceberg lettuce supplied by a single producer, sourced from a specific growing region in central Mexico, and served primarily through Taco Bell locations in Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, and West Virginia. The supplier voluntarily pulled all iceberg lettuce sourced from that region off the market and initiated a recall, which importantly includes a small number of retail products sold at Walmart under a private label, specifically certain iceberg salad and shredded lettuce packages. I'll walk you through exactly what to look for in a few minutes, because that part matters most for what's sitting in your own kitchen tonight. Here's the piece I think is genuinely important to understand, because it explains why the case count is so high and why officials are being careful about how they talk about it. According to the latest information available, more than 1,600 people who reported eating at the affected Taco Bell locations have been identified as part of this specific investigation, with illness onset dates ranging from mid-May into mid-July. Separately, and this is a distinction worth sitting with for a second, health officials have noted that Cyclospora infections are surging nationally this year, well beyond what's typically seen, with the current year already surpassing prior records for reported cases. Some of those additional cases across the country are believed to be connected to travel or to other separate sources entirely, and officials are still working to understand how much of the broader national increase connects to this specific lettuce-linked outbreak versus other causes. That's an important, honest gap in the information right now, and I'd rather tell you that plainly than pretend there's more certainty than there actually is. So let's talk about what Cyclospora actually is, because I think understanding the mechanism helps everything else make sense. Cyclospora is a tiny single-celled parasite, and it spreads specifically through food or water that has come into contact even indirectly with human fecal matter. This typically happens through contaminated water used during growing, washing, or processing of produce, particularly leafy greens and fresh herbs, which have a lot of surface area and are eaten raw without cooking, which would otherwise kill the parasite, unlike bacteria such as E. coli or Salmonella, which can sometimes make you sick within hours. Cyclospora has a longer incubation period. Symptoms typically don't appear until roughly a week after exposure, sometimes longer, which is exactly why tracing an outbreak like this back to its source is so difficult and time-consuming for investigators. Think about what that delay actually means for a moment. If you got sick today, the lettuce that caused it likely wasn't something you ate this morning. It might have been something you ate a full week ago, something you've probably already forgotten about, sitting on a plate you cleared without a second thought. That gap between exposure and symptoms is precisely why health investigators have to rely on detailed interviews, comparing what dozens or hundreds of sick people all happened to eat in the days before they got ill, looking for that common thread. It's slow, careful work, and it's part of why outbreak investigations like this one can take weeks to fully resolve, even after a likely source has been identified. Once the parasite does take hold, the primary symptom is watery diarrhea, often frequent and sometimes described by patients as sudden or explosive, along with symptoms like loss of appetite, weight loss, stomach cramping, bloating, increased gas, fatigue, and occasionally a low-grade fever. Here's something that catches a lot of people off guard. Without treatment, symptoms can last for weeks and in some cases can seem to improve and then return again in a frustrating cycle that makes people wonder if they're dealing with something entirely different the second time around. The good news is that it's typically treated effectively with a specific course of antibiotics once it's properly diagnosed, but that diagnosis usually requires a stool test specifically looking for this parasite, which isn't always the first thing tested for with a general stomach bug. Now let's talk about why I specifically framed this video around adults over 60, because I want to be careful here and not fall into the trap of making blanket statements that don't reflect reality. Not every person over 60 is medically fragile, and I'm not going to suggest otherwise. What I will say is that some adults over 60 may face additional concerns with an illness like this for reasons that are worth understanding clearly rather than just being told to be careful without explanation. The first reason involves prolonged diarrhea and dehydration. When your body loses fluid rapidly and repeatedly over days or weeks, it's not just uncomfortable, it can become a genuine physiological strain, and that strain tends to be handled less efficiently as the body ages, partly because kidney function and overall fluid regulation naturally become somewhat less responsive over the decades. Alongside fluid loss, your body also loses electrolytes, which are minerals like sodium and potassium that your nerves, muscles, and heart depend on to function properly. When those levels drop significantly, particularly in someone who may already be managing a heart condition or taking certain medications, the situation can shift from an unpleasant stomach illness into something that genuinely deserves medical evaluation, sometimes urgently. The second reason involves appetite and weight. An illness that causes days or weeks of digestive symptoms often comes with a real loss of appetite. And for someone already managing a smaller frame, existing muscle loss, or a chronic condition, even a temporary period of reduced eating and unintended weight loss can take longer to recover from than it would for a younger, larger-framed adult. This isn't about being weak or fragile. It's simply a physiological reality of how the body's reserves change over time. The third reason involves medications. A lot of adults over 60 are on regular prescriptions, sometimes several. Prolonged vomiting or diarrhea can affect how well your body absorbs those medications, and dehydration itself can affect how certain drugs, including some blood pressure medications, are processed by your kidneys. This is exactly the kind of situation where a phone call to your doctor or pharmacist just to ask whether anything needs to be adjusted temporarily is a reasonable and responsible step, not an overreaction. Let me walk you through a hypothetical example because I think it makes this more concrete than simply listing risk factors. Imagine a 68-year-old who ordered fast food one evening, including a shredded lettuce topping, without giving it a second thought, the way most of us order food most days. A week later, she develops what she assumes is a routine stomach bug, some cramping, some diarrhea. She waits it out for a few days the way she normally would, assuming it'll pass on its own like it usually has in the past. But instead of resolving, it continues. And by day 10, she's lost several pounds, she's more tired than usual, and she started noticing she feels lightheaded when she stands up quickly. That combination, a digestive illness lasting well beyond a typical few days, combined with weight loss and signs of dehydration, is exactly the point where reaching out to a doctor stops being optional caution and becomes a genuinely important step, particularly because a specific stool test can identify this particular parasite and lead to an effective targeted treatment. I want to pause here and address something you might already be wondering. At this point, are you supposed to just stop eating lettuce entirely? Stop eating salad, stop eating any fresh vegetable that might have touched a processing facility somewhere? I understand exactly why that thought crosses people's minds after hearing something like this, and I want to answer it clearly and honestly, because the answer isn't avoid all produce, and it wouldn't be responsible of me to suggest that. Here's the distinction that actually matters. This outbreak has been traced, based on FDA traceback investigation, to a specific supplier's iceberg lettuce, sourced from a specific growing region, representing, according to that same supplier's own statement, less than 1% of the entire U.S. iceberg lettuce supply. That is not the same thing as all lettuce is dangerous. It's not even the same thing as all iceberg lettuce is dangerous. It's a specific supply chain from a specific source during a specific window of time that has now been pulled from the market and recalled, treating an entire food category as permanently unsafe because of one contamination event isn't an evidence-based response, it's an emotional one, and I understand the instinct, but it doesn't actually serve you well. That said, here's what I do want you to actually check tonight, because this is the practical part of this video, and it's the reason I wanted you to watch the whole way through rather than just skimming a headline. Go look in your refrigerator for any iceberg lettuce salad or shredded lettuce product sold under the MarketSide brand, specifically packages labeled as iceberg salad in 12-ounce or 24-ounce sizes, or shredded lettuce in 8-ounce or 16-ounce sizes, with a best if used by date falling between mid-July and early August of this year. If you have MarketSide product matching that description, don't eat it. Throw it away, or if you prefer, return it to the store where you bought it. If you've eaten at Taco Bell recently in one of the affected states and developed digestive symptoms that started roughly a week later and have lasted more than a few days, that's worth mentioning to your doctor specifically, since it may help guide testing. If you don't have that specific recalled product and you haven't eaten at one of those specific restaurant locations recently, this particular recall doesn't apply directly to what's currently in your kitchen. I know that might feel like an oddly narrow, specific answer after everything we've just discussed, but that specificity is actually the entire point. Outbreaks like this are traced to precise sources for a reason, and responding with precise, targeted action rather than a broad, sweeping fear of an entire food category is what the actual evidence supports. I do want to gently correct a few common misunderstandings I see repeated constantly whenever a food safety story like this comes up, because I think clearing them up will actually make you more capable of handling situations like this in the future, not just this one. Many people reasonably assume that if food looks and smells normal, it must be safe. The problem is that Cyclospora, along with several other foodborne pathogens, doesn't change the appearance, smell, or taste of food at all. What the evidence actually suggests is that visual inspection tells you nothing meaningful about contamination with this particular type of parasite. The practical takeaway is that recall and sourcing information matters far more than how the product looks on your counter. Many people also reasonably assume that thoroughly washing produce eliminates any risk. The problem is that washing can reduce, but does not reliably eliminate, certain contaminants, particularly a hardy parasite like Cyclospora, which can be more resistant to simple rinsing than typical bacterial contamination. What the evidence actually suggests is that washing remains a reasonable, sensible practice for general hygiene, but it is not a guarantee of safety once a product has already been identified as part of a recall. The practical takeaway is that recalled products should be discarded, not simply washed more thoroughly and eaten anyway. There's also a common assumption that organic or locally sourced produce is automatically safer than mass-distributed produce. The problem is that contamination is about water quality, handling practices, and processing conditions, not about whether something carries an organic label or came from a farm nearby. What the evidence actually suggests is that outbreaks have occurred across organic, conventional, local, and large-scale supply chains alike. The practical takeaway is that paying attention to actual recall notices and official guidance is a far more reliable strategy than assuming any particular label guarantees safety. I also want to address something that comes up in the comments of nearly every video like this, and that's the question of natural remedies. If you search online for how to treat parasitic infections naturally, you will find no shortage of confident claims involving garlic, oregano oil, various herbal tinctures, and cleanses. I want to handle this respectfully because I understand the appeal of wanting a natural option, and I'm not here to mock anyone's interest in that approach. Here's the honest picture. Some of these substances, garlic in particular, have shown antimicrobial activity in laboratory settings, meaning in a petri dish, under controlled conditions. Laboratory activity is genuinely interesting scientifically, but it is a long way from proving that eating more garlic will reliably clear a parasitic infection in an actual human digestive system. There is no solid clinical evidence supporting natural remedies as an effective treatment for Cyclosporiasis specifically, and relying on one instead of appropriate testing and treatment risks, allowing a treatable infection to continue causing dehydration, weight loss, and prolonged illness, particularly concerning for the reasons we discussed earlier regarding adults over 60. If you enjoy incorporating those foods into your diet generally, there's nothing wrong with that, but please don't let an unproven remedy delay you from seeking appropriate testing, and if needed, the antibiotic treatment that actually has solid evidence behind it for this specific illness. Let's talk for a moment about warning signs, because I think this is genuinely useful information regardless of whether this particular outbreak affects you directly. I'm not going to tell you that any stomach discomfort means you have Cyclospora specifically, because plenty of things cause digestive upset, and I have no way of diagnosing you through a video, nor would I try to. What I can tell you is what generally distinguishes an ordinary short-lived stomach upset from something that deserves prompt medical attention. A mild stomach issue that resolves within a day or two without significant fever, without an inability to keep fluids down, is typically something you can manage at home with rest and hydration. On the other hand, diarrhea that persists beyond several days, particularly beyond a week, unintentional weight loss, signs of significant dehydration such as dizziness when standing, a noticeably dry mouth, dark urine, or significantly reduced urination, confusion, or an inability to keep any fluids down at all, those are signs that warrant reaching out to a healthcare professional rather than continuing to wait it out. This is especially true if you're managing an existing heart, kidney, or blood pressure condition where dehydration carries additional weight beyond the discomfort itself. If you appreciate having health information explained this way, calmly, clearly, with the actual evidence laid out rather than manufactured panic, that's really the entire purpose behind this channel. And it's why I'd encourage you to subscribe if you haven't already. There's more of this kind of grounded, practical health conversation coming, and I'd rather you leave this video informed than simply alarmed. I want to step back now and talk about the bigger picture here, because I think there's a lesson in this outbreak that extends well beyond this particular event, this particular lettuce supplier, or this particular summer. Food safety outbreaks like this one happen periodically, not because the food supply is fundamentally broken, but because agriculture at the scale required to feed a country involves an enormous number of variables: water sources, processing facilities, transportation, storage, that occasionally intersect in ways that allow contamination to occur. The system that catches these events, the FDA traceback investigations, the CDC's coordination with state health departments, the recall process itself exists precisely because these events happen. And its job is to identify, contain, and communicate them as quickly and accurately as possible. That system isn't perfect, and it isn't instantaneous, which is part of why there's a real delay between when an outbreak likely started and when a recall is announced. But it does work, and this outbreak is a demonstration of that process actually functioning, identifying a specific source, and removing it from the supply chain. The deeper, more durable lesson here isn't about lettuce specifically. It's about developing a habit, a genuinely useful one, of paying attention to official recall information periodically, the same way you might check the weather or glance at the news. The FDA and CDC both maintain public recall and outbreak pages that are updated regularly, and many local news outlets pick up major recalls quickly as well. You don't need to check obsessively or live in a state of constant food vigilance. That would be exhausting and counterproductive. But building a light habit of occasionally checking whether anything currently in your kitchen has been part of a recent recall is a genuinely reasonable, low-effort practice, particularly for products with a longer shelf life that might sit in your refrigerator for a week or two before you get around to using them. So let me bring this back to something simple and practical, a small action plan you can actually use, not just tonight, but going forward whenever something like this comes up in the news. First, when you hear about a recall or outbreak connected to a food you might have at home, check the specific product name, brand, size, and date range involved, rather than reacting to the general food category alone. Second, if what you have matches a recalled product, discard it or return it. Don't simply wash it more thoroughly and hope for the best. Third, if you develop digestive symptoms that last more than a few days, involve significant fluid loss, or come with weight loss or weakness, don't wait it out indefinitely. Reach out to your doctor and mention any relevant food history if you have it, since that can help guide testing. Fourth, keep taking your regular fresh produce seriously as part of a healthy diet. Don't let one specific outbreak turn into a permanent sweeping fear of vegetables, generally because that response isn't supported by the evidence and it works against your broader health in the long run. One quick, honest note before we close. This video is meant to help you understand a real, evolving public health situation and think through it clearly, But it isn't a substitute for personal medical advice, and the situation itself may continue to change as investigators learn more. If you have specific symptoms, specific questions about your own medications, or specific concerns about your own health, please bring those directly to your doctor or pharmacist who knows your individual situation far better than any video can. Let's go back to where we started, that refrigerator, that bag of lettuce or container of salad sitting on the shelf. Here's what I actually want you to take away from tonight. Check specifically for that market-side iceberg salad or shredded lettuce with those specific dates. And if you find it, get rid of it calmly and without drama. If you don't find it, there's no need to throw out every leafy green in your kitchen out of general anxiety. That response doesn't match what the evidence actually tells us. What I want you to hold on to isn't fear of lettuce. It's a slightly sharper sense of how these situations actually work, what a targeted recall means versus a blanket food scare, and what warning signs in your own body genuinely deserve a phone call rather than simply waiting it out. That's really the whole philosophy behind why I make videos like this one. Not to make you afraid of your own kitchen, but to make sure that when something like this does show up in the headlines, you're equipped to look at it clearly, separate what's actually known from what's still uncertain, and make a calm, informed decision for yourself and for the people you care about. You don't need to panic tonight. You just need to go check that refrigerator, take a look at what's actually there, and now you'll know exactly what you're looking for. Take care of yourselves this week, and I'll see you in the next one.